Every Ashcroft son vanished before his 21st birthday, leaving behind only whispers and unanswered prayers. What cursed legacy could condemn an entire bloodline to such a fate? The Ashcroft estate stood as a monument to both grandeur and dread, a Gothic sprawl of stone and ivy tucked deep into the English countryside. Those who passed its gates often spoke in hushed tones, for the family name carried with it a curse so deeply rooted in time that no one could untangle it from mere coincidence. The story of the Ashcrofts was not of financial ruin or scandalous betrayal, though they had their share of both, but of something far more sinister. Every son born into the family vanished before reaching his 21st birthday. Sorry to interrupt, but I gotta ask, where are you tuning in from? Drop it in the comments. It was said to have begun with Samuel Ashcroft in 1792, a bright and ambitious young man who was meant to inherit not only his father's wealth, but also his political seat. Days before his 21st birthday, Samuel disappeared from his chamber, the bedclothes tossed aside as though he had risen in the night. Servants swore they heard heavy footsteps echoing through the east wing, though no one was found. His body was never recovered. The family declared it a tragedy of youthful folly, claiming he must have run away, but whispers throughout the village suggested darker forces at play. From there, the pattern repeated with unnerving precision. Henry Ashcroft, spirited away in 1821. Thomas, lost in 1853. Charles, vanished in 1887. Each time, the sons were on the cusp of adulthood, their futures bright, their disappearances unexplainable. The Ashcroft women, widows and mothers alike, were left to mourn in silence, while the estate grew ever more burdened with grief. Some said the curse was born from an oath broken centuries earlier, while others believed a darker truth, that something within the estate itself demanded sacrifice. By the time the 20th century arrived, the Ashcrofts no longer attempted to explain away the vanishings. The curse had been written into local lore, and those who lived near the estate crossed themselves at the mention of a son's impending birthday. No amount of wealth, land, or influence could protect the family from what came for their heirs. The estate's portraits bore silent witness, the painted eyes of each lost boy staring down at guests who dared step inside the grand halls. What unsettled most was the eerie calmness with which the family carried on. When Edward Ashcroft disappeared in 1920, his father, Lord Percival, hosted a lavish dinner the following week as if nothing had happened. Guests whispered that madness had consumed him, but others suspected acceptance. After all, when tragedy becomes tradition, grief loses its sting. By the late 20th century, the Ashcroft line had dwindled to only a few scattered branches. Rumors claimed that some of the sons had been spirited away by secret societies, others by vengeful spirits. A few even suggested the family themselves had orchestrated the vanishings, bound by a pact too terrible to name. Yet with each generation, the cycle continued, the promise of a young heir, followed by disappearance before the age of 21. The estate itself bore scars of the curse. Windows bricked up in rooms where boys had last been seen, halls sealed off entirely. Locals whispered of strange noises, footsteps in abandoned corridors, soft weeping behind locked doors, the sound of scratching at the walls late into the night. The Ashcrofts denied everything, but the villagers knew. The curse was alive, patient, and it would not be broken. The true horror of the Ashcroft legacy was not simply in the vanishings, but in the silence that followed them. No ransom notes, no bodies, no explanations, just the echoing reminder that the bloodline was doomed and that no son could escape the fate awaiting him before his 21st birthday. The winter after Thomas's disappearance was the coldest anyone in Warrenshire could remember. Snow fell in endless drifts, piling against the windows of cottages and suffocating the fields. The villagers spoke of it as punishment, a season sent to remind them that the world was ruled not by men, but by something far older and merciless. Blackthorn Manor, with its high chimneys and endless halls, became a prison rather than a home for the remaining Ashcrofts. Within its stone walls, Life carried on with a brittle kind of determination. Margaret Ashcroft, Thomas's mother, aged decades in months. Her eyes, once soft with warmth, grew hollow, her hands trembling as though her body carried the memory of some terrible knowledge she dared not speak. Servants whispered that she had been the last to see Thomas, standing in the doorway of the great library where the boy loved to read. She had found the candle still burning, the chair pushed out as though he had risen only moments before. Yet there had been no sound of footsteps, no door opening or closing, no whisper of cloth brushing against the air. Only the terrible silence of absence. His father, Reginald Ashcroft, however, would not speak of loss. To him, a missing son was a shame, a stain upon the Ashcroft name. He scolded Margaret for her mourning, dismissing her grief as weakness, though his own hands shook when he signed his letters in the study at night. His voice, once a commanding baritone, cracked under the strain of false composure. The villagers noted the way his carriage no longer appeared in the town square, how he refused to attend Mass, and how his temper had grown violent with even the most minor of disturbances. It was as if Thomas's absence had severed the spine of his pride, and yet it was not merely the parents who felt the curse tightening around them. Thomas had left behind two younger siblings, Edmund and Clara. Edmund, at 16, was old enough to understand what was whispered in the servants' quarters, but too young to resist the pull of fear. He would lie awake at night listening for sounds in the corridors, the distant scraping of wood, the creak of doors that should have been shut, and the occasional hushed murmur of voices that seemed not to belong to the living. Clara, only 10, wandered the house clutching one of Thomas's gloves, claiming that her brother spoke to her in dreams. The staff grew restless. Some left without notice, abandoning their wages and possessions rather than remain in a place where shadows lingered too long. Those who stayed told stories in hushed tones by the kitchen hearth. They spoke of a history repeating itself, of the first Ashcroft son who had disappeared before reaching his 21st birthday nearly a century ago. They warned that the family was marked, bound to some old and terrible bargain struck by an ancestor whose ambition outweighed his sanity. One evening, as the snowstorm rattled the manor's shutters, Edmund confided in his mother. He had found strange etchings in the library desk where Thomas last sat, carved into the underside of the wood. They were not words of English, nor any tongue Edmund recognized, but looping symbols, sharp and interwoven, almost alive in their complexity. Margaret begged him to forget what he had seen, but her face betrayed knowledge she had long carried, perhaps since before her marriage. It was in that moment Edmund realized the truth. Thomas had not simply vanished. He had been taken, claimed by a darkness that hovered over the Ashcroft line, waiting patiently for each son in turn. The Ashcroft estate had always stood like a shadow against the northern horizon, its towering spires jutting out above the skeletal trees that lined the property. But by the time young Thomas Ashcroft was born in 1826, the place had begun to rot from within. The walls were cracking with damp, ivy clawed at the windows like some creeping parasite, and entire wings of the manor had been abandoned. Despite this, the family persisted in hosting extravagant gatherings, as though the ghosts of their grandeur could be resurrected with fine wine and feigned laughter. It was in this crumbling world that Thomas grew, and it was here, too, where his fate was sealed. Thomas had been an unusually quiet child, with eyes too old for his years. Servants whispered that he could see things no one else could, shadows moving along the corridor walls even when no one walked there, whispers that slithered through the keyholes, and faces pressing against mirrors before fading into nothing. His mother, Eleanor, dismissed it as childish imagination, but his father, Richard, grew increasingly uneasy. Richard was a practical man, yet his own childhood had been marked by strange terrors. His brother Edward's disappearance at 17, swallowed by the mist near the family's hunting grounds. He recognized something of that same strangeness in his son. At 17, Thomas began spending long hours in the manor's old library, poring over journals left behind by generations of Ashcrofts. He had a particular fascination with the leather-bound diary of an ancestor, Christopher Ashcroft, who had vanished at 19 during the late 1600s. In those fragile pages, Christopher described dreams of figures cloaked in bone-white veils, their hands stretched out in invitation. "They wait beyond the threshold," Christopher had written, their voices like 1,000 bells tolling in unison. "They call me, and I fear I will not resist much longer." It was around this same age that Thomas's own nightmares began. He confided in a maid once, telling her he had dreamt of a figure with no face standing at the foot of his bed. She swore the boy looked paler with each passing day, his cheeks hollowing as though the night itself was feeding upon him. Not long after, he stopped eating properly, claiming the food tasted of earth and ashes. His health dwindled, but the family's physician could find no explanation. The night of his 20th birthday, a storm ripped through the estate. Rain lashed the windows, lightning clawed at the sky, and the manor groaned like a wounded beast. Servants recalled seeing Thomas wandering barefoot through the halls, his nightshirt soaked with rain, though no one knew how he had come to be wet. When Eleanor tried to call out to him, he didn't seem to hear. He moved as though entranced, heading toward the east wing of the house, the part of the manor sealed off for decades after Richard's brother had vanished there. The servants and family searched the entire wing, lighting candles against the oppressive dark, but Thomas was gone. His muddy footprints ended at the door of a bricked-up chamber, one no one had entered in over a century. There was no sound, no cry, only silence thick enough to suffocate. Days later, Richard ordered the chamber wall to be torn down in desperation. When they did, they found no trace of Thomas, only an empty room, cold as a tomb, with words scratched faintly into the stone floor. "They are here. They wait." The disappearance crushed Eleanor. She refused to leave the estate, often wandering the halls in her dressing gown at night, whispering Thomas's name as if he might still answer. Richard, meanwhile, grew bitter and reclusive, burying the family's remaining fortunes into sealing the estate further, locking doors and erecting new gates around the property. But no amount of stone or iron could bury the truth that had stalked them for generations. Another Ashcroft son had vanished, just as the others before him, and the curse, it seemed, had only grown hungrier. The Ashcroft estate was built upon a bluff, its foundations sunk into the limestone as though clinging to the earth out of defiance. By the time the fourth son of the family was born, whispers already hung like mildew around the manor's windows. Servants crossed themselves when his name was spoken aloud, and locals avoided passing too close to the wrought iron gates that rusted silently beneath the fog. This boy, Julian Ashcroft, carried within him both the burden of expectation and the curse of lineage. His birth was marked not by celebration, but by a grim awareness of the pattern that had claimed 3 sons before him. Yet, despite the inevitability that others saw in his future, Julian was different. He was curious, intelligent, and unusually aware of the shadows that surrounded his family. From an early age, Julian grew fascinated with the stories told in hushed voices by the staff and townsfolk. Unlike his brothers, who either ignored or dismissed the strange fate awaiting them, he sought out the truth. He prowled the old corridors of Ashcroft Manor at night, lantern in hand, poring over rotting ledgers, forgotten journals, and the scraps of parchment that his ancestors had left behind. He found references to blood debts and bargains with nameless figures, to nights when thunder shook the foundations of the house, and lightning illuminated cloaked visitors at the front door. Julian's mother, Eleanor, begged him to leave such things alone. She had watched 3 sons vanish into the night without explanation, their absence leaving behind nothing but silence and grief. But Julian would not be deterred. His obsession deepened when he discovered an iron-bound trunk in the attic. Inside were relics of his brothers, a lock of hair tied with ribbon, a cracked pocket watch, and most disturbingly, a diary belonging to Thomas, the eldest, who vanished at the age of 20. The entries grew increasingly frantic toward the end, filled with warnings of eyes watching from the woods, of whispers through the keyhole, of footsteps pacing outside his door, long after the household had gone to bed. Julian began to sleep with a knife beneath his pillow, though he knew it was a futile gesture against something he could neither see nor understand. At times, he swore he could hear breathing in the corners of his room. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, and mirrors seemed to ripple when he looked too long into them. On the eve of his 20th birthday, Julian confided to his mother that he believed the curse was not random but precise, tied to an ancient covenant that demanded the firstborn sons be claimed before adulthood could settle upon them. The night of his disappearance arrived with no storm, no great commotion, only silence. He had barricaded his room, locking doors and nailing shut the windows. Yet when morning came, the locks were still intact, the boards undisturbed. His mother found the room empty, the bed unslept in, the diary open on the desk with the final words scrawled in trembling ink. "They have come. I can hear their voices in the walls." Julian Ashcroft was gone. The fourth son, like those before him, had vanished into the black maw of the family's curse. His absence deepened the dread that clung to the Ashcroft name, and the townsfolk began to whisper not just of tragedy, but of complicity. They wondered if the Ashcrofts themselves were keeping a pact with the darkness, an agreement that required the blood of their own children. By the time the third generation of Ashcroft sons had come of age, whispers about the family's supposed curse were not just idle tavern talk, but part of the cultural fabric of their town. Mothers told their children not to play near the Ashcroft estate after sundown, and superstitious locals swore they saw pale lights glowing in the windows, even when the house was supposed to be empty. The family, proud and stubborn, dismissed all such chatter as nonsense, yet within their walls unease festered. Each generation seemed determined to break the cycle, but by the fifth chapter of this lineage's story, the patterns were too sinister to ignore. Edward Ashcroft was different from the others before him. Where his predecessors were withdrawn, often consumed with studies or the responsibilities of land and title, Edward was lively, full of energy, and fiercely independent. He was not content to wait for life to unfold within the suffocating halls of the Ashcroft manor. He loved horses, he loved the wild country, and he loved defying expectations. By the time he turned 19, Edward was a familiar sight in the village, racing through town on horseback, laughing with friends in the local tavern, and sometimes even performing reckless stunts that made him the subject of admiration among his peers. For the first time in decades, the Ashcroft name carried an air of excitement instead of fear. Yet his parents lived in silent dread, watching the calendar with haunted eyes. They had both lost brothers to the curse, each disappearing days before turning 21, and now they found themselves caught between encouraging their son's zest for life and restraining his wild impulses. They warned him constantly not to tempt fate, but Edward only laughed. He did not believe in curses. "I will be the one to break it," he told his mother on countless occasions. "You'll see. I'll live to be an old man, and my sons will laugh at the silly stories people tell about us." But as Edward's 21st birthday drew near, strange occurrences began to darken his days. His horse, once so obedient, threw him violently to the ground without warning, leaving him with a fractured arm. His closest friend, a fellow young nobleman, drowned suddenly in a nearby river after claiming to have seen Edward's face reflected beneath the surface. Even Edward could no longer dismiss these signs. His nights grew restless, plagued with vivid dreams of faceless figures standing at the foot of his bed, whispering in voices he could not understand. The townsfolk claimed they saw Edward wandering the estate grounds at odd hours, his eyes vacant, his movements slow, as if he were sleepwalking. Servants swore they heard footsteps pacing outside Edward's chambers long after he had locked his door. His parents, terrified, sought priests and scholars, paying handsomely for prayers, charms, and rituals that promised protection. Nothing seemed to quiet the encroaching shadow that gathered around him. On the night of his 21st birthday, the household locked every door and window. Guards patrolled the estate grounds. Edward's mother prayed without pause while his father drank heavily, muttering about fate's cruelty. Yet, when dawn broke, Edward's bed was empty. The locks remained untouched, the windows still barred, but the young man was gone. His clothes lay neatly folded on the chair by the fireplace, and in the ashes of the hearth, the guards found a single black feather, singed at the edges as though it had been touched by flame. The Ashcrofts had once again lost a son, and this time The evidence was even more chilling than before. The curse had proven itself unbreakable, and the family's resolve was beginning to shatter under the weight of dread. No matter how fiercely they denied it, the world seemed determined to remind them. No son of Ashcroft would ever live to see his 21st year. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Ashcroft name had become synonymous not with power or privilege, but with a hushed curse that followed them wherever they attempted to start anew. The family's once sprawling estate had fallen into disrepair, its wings locked and left to rot as vines coiled through broken windows. Yet the shadow it cast on its surviving members was darker still. Every son born into the bloodline carried the same unspoken countdown, the haunting inevitability of vanishing before reaching his 21st birthday. It was in 1904 that the cycle gripped yet another Ashcroft heir, this time in a city far removed from the brooding halls of Ashcroft Manor. Jonathan Ashcroft was a bright, modern young man by every account, far more attuned to the bustling energy of industrial London than the superstitions of his ancestors. Friends remembered him as witty, quick with a joke, and endlessly curious. Unlike the brooding portraits that lined his family's estate, Jonathan seemed like an ordinary soul, untouched by the weight of legend. Yet behind closed doors, his mother, Evelyn, carried dread in her heart. She had been only a child when her elder brother vanished without trace, and though her own life had been spared, she was old enough to recall the anguished silence that followed. Jonathan had always laughed at her nervous warnings. He insisted that curses belonged in dusty novels, not in the rational world of electric lamps and motor cars. But as his 21st birthday approached, strange events began to weave into his once ordinary life. He complained of waking in the dead of night to find his bedroom door ajar, though he swore he had bolted it shut. He claimed he heard faint footsteps pacing his boarding house corridor, slow and measured, even when all others swore they were asleep. At first, he dismissed these incidents as imagination fueled by his mother's anxious stories. But as weeks passed, his confidence began to waver. His friends noticed how his sharp humor dulled, how his eyes flicked nervously toward empty corners. He started skipping gatherings, choosing instead to sit awake by candlelight, clutching a small revolver he purchased with trembling hands. Letters written to his mother revealed his growing unease, each one more frantic than the last. "It feels as though something waits for me," he confessed in one. "Not death, but something worse, something patient." On the night of his 21st birthday, his friends organized a celebration, determined to shake him free of his gloom. They gathered in a smoky pub, raising glasses and singing until the room swelled with warmth. Jonathan smiled for the first time in months, though those closest to him said the expression was fragile, forced. At the stroke of midnight, when the final toast was raised to his health and freedom from childish superstition, Jonathan lifted his glass. And then he was gone. No scream, no sign of struggle, no shattering of glass. One moment he was standing among his friends, the next the air seemed to thin around where he had been, and only silence remained. Chairs scraped back, voices shouted in confusion, but Jonathan Ashcroft had disappeared as though swallowed by the air itself. Witnesses swore that no one had seen him leave, nor had they heard a door open or close. The constables who investigated later dismissed it as some elaborate prank or drunken mistake. Yet none could explain how a man could vanish in the center of a crowded room. His mother received the news with a hollow calm, as though she had braced her entire life for that very moment. She locked herself away, refusing visitors, and the letters she wrote afterward carried no hope, only resignation. "It will never end," she wrote. "The shadow takes them one after another, and it will not rest until no son remains to bear the Ashcroft name." The story of Jonathan's disappearance spread quickly, whispered in pubs and printed in sensational newspapers that framed it as a supernatural mystery. For the Ashcrofts, however, it was simply another link in the chain that bound them to an inexorable fate. Each son was born into promise, each mother cradled her child with trembling arms, and each father, if he lived long enough, watched the clock tick down to an inevitable vanishing. And though the world outside moved steadily into modernity, for the Ashcrofts, the curse remained timeless, relentless, and merciless. The town of Denshire had grown weary of the Ashcroft name by the time the seventh tragedy befell them. The family, once revered for their wealth and landholdings, had by then become synonymous with grief. Whispers lingered in the taverns and churches that to bear the name Ashcroft was to invite death before manhood, that no son of the house would ever live long enough to know true adulthood. Despite these dark rumors, Lady Eleanor Ashcroft, the matriarch of that generation, clung to faith and ritual as her only weapons against despair. She had watched 6 sons vanish over the decades, each before his 21st birthday, and when her youngest, Edmund, neared his 15th year, she doubled her efforts to break what others called a curse. Eleanor was not like the mothers before her. Where they had wept in silence and left their grief to God, she sought out every means, holy and unholy, to shield her boy. Priests were brought from London, their voices echoing through the halls with chants of exorcism. She burned frankincense until the walls were coated with a sticky residue. She even brought in a Jewish mystic from across the sea, who painted sigils in ash on Edmund's door and warned her in hushed tones that something ancient, something bound to the bloodline, awaited its due. None of it brought peace to her heart. Edmund himself seemed oblivious to the heavy air surrounding him. He was a bright boy, quick with a jest and endlessly curious. He loved to wander the woods that fringed the estate, finding bird nests or curious stones that he would tuck into his pockets and bring home as if they were treasures. To Eleanor's horror, his favorite path led him directly to the Black Hollow, a sunless glade spoken of in hushed voices by villagers. They said it was a place where men had vanished, their bones sometimes found months later at the roots of twisted trees. She forbade him to go, but Edmund's smile and boyish defiance often made her commands seem like mere suggestions. When his 17th birthday passed without incident, hope sparked in Eleanor's heart. She thought perhaps the curse had weakened, perhaps her relentless prayers had taken hold. But hope, in Ashcroft history, was always fragile. One night, during a fierce storm, Edmund failed to return from his walk. Eleanor's screams echoed through the estate as she tore through the halls searching for him. Servants scoured the grounds with lanterns, their lights bobbing through the mist like fireflies. At dawn, they found his shoes neatly placed at the edge of the Black Hollow, as though he had stepped out of them before walking into the darkness barefoot. The townsfolk shook their heads, for the pattern was clear. No son survived, and none left behind even the dignity of a proper death. Edmund had become the 7th in a line of vanished heirs, claimed by something unseen. Eleanor withdrew into herself after that, spending her final years in the chapel, whispering prayers that no one believed would be answered. She died clutching Edmund's favorite stone in her hand. And so, the curse deepened. The hollow swallowed the laughter of the last Ashcroft boy of that generation, leaving only silence and the sound of wind through the ancient trees. The years following Jonathan Ashcroft's disappearance were unlike any that had come before. Whereas previous losses had been met with whispers, rumors, and half-hearted inquiries, the vanishing of Jonathan ignited something far more tangible, a full-blown hysteria. The townspeople, once hesitant to speak aloud of curses and spirits, now muttered them openly, almost proudly, as if invoking the supernatural explanation was safer than confronting the more human possibilities. By now, the Ashcroft legacy was infamous, an unsettling point of local folklore. Every child was raised on the cautionary tale of the Ashcroft sons who never saw their 21st birthdays, and Jonathan's case only added fuel to the fearful fire. In the sprawling corridors of Ashcroft Manor, grief weighed heavily upon Beatrice Ashcroft, Jonathan's mother. She had been the first Ashcroft matriarch in generations to resist belief in the curse. When her husband had spoken of it, half in jest and half in nervous seriousness, she would scoff, calling it a convenient excuse for a family too, proud to admit the weaknesses of their blood. But Jonathan's disappearance had broken her certainty. For nights after he vanished, she wandered the halls whispering his name, placing candles at each door as though lighting a pathway home. Servants reported finding her in the library, poring over old journals written by long-dead Ashcroft patriarchs, her hands trembling as she traced passages that spoke of sons devoured by shadows and sins echoing through generations. The manor itself seemed to turn against its inhabitants. Doors creaked at odd hours, voices carried in the walls, and faint footsteps followed those who dared walk alone at night. It was as though Jonathan's vanishing had awoken something dormant. Beatrice became convinced that the manor itself was alive. Its stones soaked with the tragedies of her ancestors, its rafters echoing with their unfulfilled cries. She took to writing letters to her son, addressed and sealed, then left them upon his empty bed each night. She believed, or hoped, that some unseen hand might carry them to wherever he was trapped. The town of Rexley grew hostile. Suspicion, always simmering just beneath the surface, now turned violent. Some villagers claimed the Ashcrofts practiced occult rites, trading their sons' lives for wealth and influence. Others suggested that madness ran deep in the bloodline, and the boys' disappearances were not vanishings, but dark family crimes hidden away. Groups of townsfolk began gathering at the gates, hurling accusations at the house, demanding the truth. Torches were carried on more than one occasion, though no mob dared breach the iron gates for fear of what might lie within. The Ashcrofts, once regarded as lords of the region, were now pariahs cloaked in suspicion. Beatrice's husband, Edmund, grew increasingly reclusive. He stopped attending church, ignored council meetings, and let his business affairs fall into ruin. Some said he was consumed by guilt, others that he knew more than he would ever confess. One night he was heard shouting in his study, his voice breaking in fury and despair. "Take me instead! Let it end with me!" But the curse, or whatever power guided it, seemed deaf to his pleas. For the servants who remained, the manor was a place of dread. They whispered of a boy's laughter echoing down the west wing, where no one had set foot in years. Shadows sometimes lengthened unnaturally, stretching across walls with shapes that did not belong to any living thing. More than one maid quit suddenly, refusing to return even for her wages. It was during this time that an old book surfaced in Beatrice's search for answers. It had belonged to Nathaniel Ashcroft, the patriarch who had first laid the foundations of the family fortune centuries earlier. Within its cracked leather covers, amidst ledgers of trade and property, she discovered pages written in cipher, detailing rituals of bloodlines, contracts sealed in secrecy, and a chilling refrain. The sons must pay the price until the debt is fulfilled. Beatrice wept over those words, for they confirmed what she had long feared but refused to accept. The Ashcrofts had inherited not wealth alone, but a curse carved into their very lineage. Still, even as despair thickened like fog around the manor, a dangerous resolve began to grow within Beatrice. If her son had vanished into the darkness, then she would follow him there, no matter the cost. The 9th disappearance carved the deepest wound into the Ashcroft legacy, for by now the pattern was no longer an eerie suspicion, but a looming certainty that no son would live to see his 21st birthday. The town of Hollows Point watched with morbid fascination, whispering that perhaps the family line was cursed by its own sins, or worse, by some ancient pact sealed long before anyone could remember. This son, Thomas Ashcroft, was known for his brilliance, a sharp-minded youth whose intelligence drew admiration from tutors and strangers alike. He spent countless hours in the great library of Ashcroft Manor, poring over texts so brittle with age that dust clung to his fingers like the residue of time itself. Unlike his predecessors, Thomas did not try to flee, nor did he throw himself into reckless pleasures to forget the ticking clock above his head. Instead, he faced the approaching darkness with cold, methodical determination. Thomas had pieced together journals left behind by earlier sons, fragments of writing stuffed into floorboards, the margins of books, or scribbled in half-burned pages discarded in the fireplace. From these notes, he noticed the one commonality. Each boy had been plagued by vivid dreams, dreams so tangible that waking often felt like drowning back into another reality. These visions grew more violent as the 21st birthday approached. Some dreamt of clawing hands rising from soil, others of faceless shadows whispering names that were not their own. Thomas, however, experienced something far stranger. His dreams showed him the manor itself, but older, its walls cracked, its corridors overrun with vines, its hearths cold as graves. In these dreams, he would wander through the ruins of his own home until he reached a locked iron door in the cellar that did not exist in waking life. Behind it, he could always hear the faint scratching of something large waiting. Compelled by both fear and curiosity, Thomas began mapping the manor. Night after night, he compared his waking world to the landscapes of his dreams, searching for signs that the visions were more than just imagination. Eventually, he found an inconsistency. Beneath the cellar, behind a false wall, the ground sounded hollow. With trembling hands and a lantern that sputtered in protest, he unearthed the hidden passageway. The air that escaped was rancid, carrying with it a chill that tasted of rust and rot. At the end of the narrow stone tunnel stood the very door he had seen in his dreams. Its iron was blackened, as though scorched, and its surface was covered in strange sigils he could neither read nor comprehend. The moment he laid his palm upon the cold metal, the scratching ceased. Silence enveloped him so complete it pressed against his ears until his heartbeat sounded like a drum. He withdrew, terrified, and sealed the wall once more, yet the discovery haunted him. For weeks he could not sleep without hearing the echo of that silence, as if the house itself had paused its breath to wait for him. His family noticed his pale skin, his trembling hands, and his habit of staring into corners where nothing stirred. His mother begged him to abandon his obsessive search, but Thomas knew the truth was closer than ever, and if he could unlock it, perhaps he would be the one to finally break the chain of vanished sons. But as his 21st birthday loomed, the dreams returned, fiercer and more consuming. He no longer saw the ruined manor. He saw himself at the iron door, keys jangling in his pocket, though he owned no such keys in life. He dreamt of unlocking it, and each time the door creaked open a little further, he would wake screaming, unable to recall what lay beyond. On the night before his birthday, the family stayed awake, watching him, guarding him. Yet as the clock struck midnight, Thomas vanished from his chair before their very eyes, leaving only the lantern beside him burning with a flame that hissed and turned black. In the morning, when they broke through the cellar wall in desperation, the hidden door was gone. All that remained was solid stone. And yet, faintly, if one pressed their ear to the wall, the sound of scratching had returned. By the late 19th century, the Ashcroft name had become a whispered cautionary tale in Somerset, a subject of fireside stories meant to thrill children and unsettle adults. Yet within the family's own crumbling halls, the legend was less a tale and more a living terror, one that haunted their waking hours and poisoned their nights with dread. At the heart of this chapter stands Thomas Ashcroft, heir to the family estate in the 1870s and the reluctant bearer of a name he both despised and could not escape. Thomas had been a thoughtful boy, markedly different from his brash father and his pious mother. Where others might have filled their days with hunting or riding, Thomas immersed himself in books. He read Latin, Greek, French, and German by the age of 16, and his library of philosophy rivaled that of the town's university. Unlike his predecessors, Thomas did not rail against the curse with bravado or attempt to bury it beneath superstition. Instead, he sought to understand it, to unearth the reason behind the relentless disappearances that had plagued the family for generations. By candlelight, he pored over centuries-old journals belonging to the Ashcroft patriarchs, tracing the arc of fear that wound its way through each generation like a festering wound. He cataloged each disappearance meticulously, noting patterns, inconsistencies, and small details long overlooked. One entry, penned in 1643, spoke of a shadowy figure seen near the moors days before his son's disappearance. Another, written nearly a century later, mentioned a recurring dream of drowning, a detail Thomas himself began to recognize in his own restless nights. Each scrap of evidence seemed to stitch together into something larger, though never fully clear. What troubled him most were the margins of these journals, filled with symbols he could not easily decipher. They were not Latin, nor were they Greek. They were closer to the sigils of occult manuscripts, a subject Thomas reluctantly turned toward in his desperation. Against the protests of his mother, who begged him to let sleeping terrors lie, he corresponded with scholars and mystics across Europe. Their letters, smuggled in under the cover of darkness, fed Thomas's growing obsession. One particular letter from a German mystic in Berlin chilled him to his core. The man claimed the Ashcrofts were not cursed by accident, but by pact, a deliberate binding forged generations ago, perhaps by a desperate ancestor seeking wealth or influence. "The blood of sons is the toll," the mystic wrote. "The 21st year is the threshold of manhood, when the debt is due. You cannot break what you do not first admit." Thomas, shaken but unwilling to yield, attempted to test the theory. On the eve of his 20th birthday, he ventured into the moors, a silver crucifix around his neck, armed with books of spells and prayers. He remained there for hours, chanting words he barely understood, the winds whipping around him as though mocking his defiance. Witnesses later claimed they saw strange lights above the marsh that night, flickering and pulsing like a lantern beneath the water's surface. The next morning, Thomas was gone. His bed was unslept in, his belongings scattered across his room as though left in haste. Search parties scoured the moors, but no body was ever found. Only his crucifix, bent as though under tremendous force, was discovered near a stagnant pool of water deep within the bog. The villagers said Thomas had gone too far, that in seeking to confront the curse, he had drawn it to him more swiftly. His mother, inconsolable, locked away his journals, swearing no Ashcroft would ever again fall into such obsession. Yet the whispers persisted, that Thomas had been closer to uncovering the truth than anyone before him, and that his disappearance was not a failure, but a silencing. And so the cycle continued. Another son vanished before his 21st year, his name added to the grim litany that defined the Ashcroft line. But unlike those before him, Thomas left behind more than just grief. He left behind clues, fragments of knowledge waiting to be pieced together. For the first time in centuries, the curse no longer seemed like an unknowable specter, but a puzzle with missing pieces, pieces the future generations would be both cursed and compelled to find. By the late 18th century, the story of the Ashcrofts had grown into a grotesque tapestry, stitched together with whispers, sermons, and drunken tavern tales. Their estate, once a proud symbol of wealth and influence, now carried with it an aura so heavy that even the bravest of travelers avoided the nearby roads after sundown. Those who did pass through told of strange lights in the windows, though the manor had long been abandoned for weeks at a time, and of how the wind through its broken shutters wailed in tones that resembled anguished voices. It was during this period that the curse attached itself most violently to young Benedict Ashcroft, the heir destined, like so many before him, not to reach his 21st year. Benedict was unlike his predecessors in many ways. Where his father had been cruel, he was kind. Where his uncles had indulged in excess, he displayed moderation. He was a studious boy, drawn not to revelry but to books and to quiet walks along the moors. His temperament won him a gentleness of reputation, and many in the surrounding parish believed, perhaps naively, that such innocence might be enough to break the chain of doom. The villagers whispered that the curse could not cling to a soul so free of malice. His mother, Lady Margaret, clung to that hope desperately, guarding her son as though her vigilance alone might ward off the darkness that had consumed so many others. Yet, even as a child, Benedict was not free from the shadows. At the age of 10, he began to complain of voices in the walls, murmurs that coaxed him to wander outside at night. On more than one occasion he was discovered barefoot in the garden, standing motionless beneath the moon as though listening to some hidden command. He described dreams of drowning, though he had never stepped foot into deep water, and visions of his own body laid in the family crypt, though he had never been allowed to visit that dreadful vault. Lady Margaret, fearing madness, brought in physicians from London, who diagnosed the boy with a weak constitution of the nerves and prescribed bloodletting. But the treatments did nothing. The visions only grew sharper, the voices louder. As Benedict approached his 20th year, the family lived in a state of constant dread. No celebration marked his birthdays, for each candle brought him closer to the cursed threshold. Lady Margaret prayed nightly in the small chapel, her hands blistered from clutching the rosary, and even the servants crossed themselves when Benedict entered a room. But it was the boy himself who seemed most resigned. He often told his mother, in a voice far older than his years, "I shall not see my next winter." These words, spoken with calm certainty, chilled her more than any midnight whisper. On the eve of his 21st birthday, Benedict vanished. He had gone to bed early, as was his custom, and when his chamber was checked at dawn, his bedclothes were found undisturbed, the window slightly ajar despite the storm that raged through the night. His boots remained neatly by the door, his coat hung untouched on its peg. It was as though he had dissolved into the air, leaving behind no trace but the echo of his last words. The villagers searched the moors, the riverbanks, even the crypt itself, but nothing was ever found. His name was added to the sorrowful roll of Ashcroft sons lost to the curse, and his mother, stricken with grief, locked herself in her chamber until she too passed the following spring. Benedict's disappearance cemented the Ashcroft legend. By now, it was not merely rumor, but an established certainty. No male heir of that line would ever survive to manhood. Superstitions deepened, and even the clergy, once eager to dismiss such tales, began to mutter about divine retribution or infernal pacts. The manor grew quieter, hollower, its halls echoing with absence. The Ashcrofts had wealth still, and their lands remained vast, but all the gold and soil in the world could not purchase a future. With each vanished son, it became clearer that the family was cursed beyond redemption. The 12th chapter of the Ashcroft story takes us to the crumbling edges of the 19th century, when whispers of the family's misfortune had grown into something more tangible, an unshakable sense of doom that cloaked them like ivy curling up their estate walls. By this point, the legend of the disappearing sons was no longer a rumor confined to the village tavern, but an accepted truth, as though it were a law of nature itself. Even those far removed from the Ashcrofts, in distant counties, would lower their voices when the name arose, speaking of it as one speaks of a storm that cannot be avoided. The family, meanwhile, persisted in its desperate attempts to carve a normal life amid the macabre pattern, though fate seemed endlessly determined to drag them back into shadow. It was Jonathan Ashcroft, the patriarch of this era, who made the first radical attempt to fight the curse head-on. Jonathan was no dreamer. He was a man of method, science, and fierce logic. Having studied the works of Darwin and the new theories of heredity that were sweeping Europe, he came to believe that the curse was no supernatural affliction, but a condition running through the family's bloodline. He commissioned physicians to study his household, to take blood, hair, and samples from every living Ashcroft in hopes of finding the flaw. The doctors, however, were baffled. Nothing unusual could be determined, no affliction detected that would explain why the sons vanished before 21. To Jonathan, this was not a dismissal of his theory, but rather a sign that science had yet to catch up with the truth. He grew more determined, bordering on obsessed. The boy in question during Jonathan's tenure was his son, Henry, a youth of keen intelligence and delicate health. Henry was unlike his forebears. He was pale, bookish, and contemplative, often seen wandering the estate with volumes of poetry and philosophy tucked beneath his arm. Where earlier sons of the Ashcrofts were boisterous, reckless, and headstrong, Henry was quiet, introspective, and gentle. He had little appetite for hunting or revelry, preferring the silence of the estate's library. It was said that Henry was the first Ashcroft son to fully understand the weight of the family curse, for he had read the records, pieced together the accounts, and internalized the dread with a mind sharpened by study. Unlike his ancestors, who had been swept into the fate unwittingly, Henry anticipated it, marking the days as one might count the ticks of a doomsday clock. Jonathan, refusing to accept this inevitability, took drastic measures as Henry neared his 19th year. He forbade his son from leaving the estate grounds, hoping that confinement might thwart whatever hand carried the boys away. Guards were placed at the doors, the windows were barred, and the boy lived as though entombed within his own home. Henry, though obedient, grew restless under the suffocating restrictions. He began writing journals, filling pages with meditations on fate, freedom, and the nature of inheritance. He questioned whether he truly had a choice in the matter, or whether his father's desperate efforts only hastened what was written. The night of Henry's 20th birthday, Jonathan organized what could only be described as a vigil. The entire household kept watch, certain that if they could keep Henry safe through his 21st year, the curse would finally be broken. For weeks, nothing occurred. The guards reported no disturbances. Henry lived, though increasingly wan, as though the weight of expectation drained him. Then, in the early hours of a gray morning just months before his 21st birthday, Henry was found missing from his locked chamber. The guards swore no one had entered or left. The window remained barred, the door secured from the outside. Yet Henry was gone, leaving behind nothing but his journal open to the final line he had written the night before. The bars do not keep it out, for it lives within. Jonathan never recovered from the loss. His mind fractured, and he retreated from public life, muttering endlessly about blood and inheritance. The journal was passed among family members in hushed secrecy, a chilling reminder that perhaps the curse was not external at all, but something born within the sons themselves, something inevitable that neither science nor walls could hold back. The years that followed Edmund's disappearance were quieter than anyone expected. The Ashcroft estate, once bursting with noise from servants, visitors, and the booming voice of Edmund himself, now lay in an eerie hush. Beatrice had locked herself in her rooms, rarely emerging except to wander the grounds late at night, whispering as though she were speaking to someone unseen. The villagers said she had gone mad from grief, though others insisted she was merely speaking to Edmund's spirit. Whatever the truth, her presence only deepened the unease that seemed to radiate from the house. It was during this silence that the youngest Ashcroft son, Philip, came of age. Unlike Edmund, Philip was gentle, bookish, and timid. He had little interest in horses or hunting, preferring instead to lose himself in the family library. He read histories, folk tales, and even forbidden texts that Beatrice had once tucked away in locked cabinets. Philip was not like his brothers, and perhaps it was this difference that gave the villagers a faint glimmer of hope. Some whispered that the curse might pass him by, that his disinterest in the world of men, the reckless pursuits that had consumed his brothers, might somehow spare him. But Philip himself was not so sure. He had grown up in the shadow of disappearances. As a boy, he had hidden under his blankets at night, hearing the muffled weeping of his mother and the stern prayers of his father. He remembered William's laughter echoing in the halls and then vanishing. He remembered Henry's stubborn defiance and Edmund's bravado, each of them swallowed by the same dark fate. To Philip, the curse was not an abstract tale. It was a clock ticking louder as his 21st birthday drew near. By his 19th year, Philip began keeping a journal. Its pages, discovered much later in a false compartment behind the library's shelves, reveal the creeping dread that overtook him. He wrote of strange dreams, walking along corridors that seemed endless, only to find himself at the edge of the sea, the water black and restless. He described hearing voices outside his window at night, chanting his name in low, guttural tones. He wrote of objects moving in his room, books falling from shelves, candles snuffing themselves out, doors opening despite their locks. He was convinced the curse was not merely superstition, but an active hunting force that grew stronger as his birthday approached. Despite his terror, Philip sought answers. He began corresponding with scholars of folklore, alchemists, and even traveling mystics who passed through the countryside. Some told him the Ashcrofts had made a pact long ago, though none could explain its nature in full. Others warned him not to pry, insisting that knowledge itself could trigger the final stroke of doom. Yet Philip pressed on, convinced that understanding the curse was his only chance to break free. On the eve of his 20th year, something changed. Beatrice, who had remained distant and broken since Edmund's disappearance, entered Philip's chamber. She was pale, gaunt, her eyes sunken, but gleaming with a terrible knowledge. She sat at the edge of his bed and whispered to him for hours. What she told him, Philip never recorded in his journals, but his handwriting changed after that night, shakier, more frantic, as though his very mind trembled from the weight of her revelations. In the months that followed, Philip became a shadow of himself. He rarely ate, his skin growing gray and translucent. Servants claimed he no longer slept, but instead paced the halls with a candle, muttering to himself. The journal pages from this period are filled with fragmented phrases. They come at night, not the sea, but beneath the sea. I am marked, as they all were. His words suggest a descent into madness, or perhaps a clarity too dreadful to endure. And then, just as with his brothers, Philip vanished. Unlike the others, there were no screams, no frantic searches. He was simply gone one morning, his bed empty, his candle burnt down to a nub on the floor. In his place, on the desk by the window, lay the final entry in his journal. The 13th night calls. I go where they wait. Pray it ends with me. But it did not end. Instead, Philip's disappearance solidified what the villagers had always feared. The curse was not bound to recklessness or arrogance or defiance. It came for every son, no matter his character. The estate, once merely haunted by whispers, now stood as a mausoleum for its lost heirs, each swallowed by the same darkness before the age of 21. And though Philip had hoped to end the chain, his final act proved only that the curse was patient, unyielding, and far from finished. By the late 19th century, the Ashcroft curse had transcended the boundaries of family tragedy and become something of a legend in the surrounding counties. People whispered about it in taverns, in schoolhouses, and at the church steps. Some spoke of it with sympathy, as if the family were victims of a cruel fate. Others, more superstitious, believed the Ashcrofts had dabbled in forbidden practices and were now reaping divine punishment. This division of opinion ensured that the family's name was never uttered without a tone of either pity or dread. The estate, once seen as a symbol of wealth and influence, had turned into a place of both fascination and fear. Travelers detoured to glimpse its silhouette against the moor, and the very word Ashcroft became synonymous with darkness. It was during this period that the Ashcroft matriarch Eleanor sought answers beyond the rational. Eleanor was not the type to yield to despair, but she had lost her eldest son under the same inexplicable circumstances as generations before him. His disappearance had followed the familiar script, healthy and vibrant at 17, only to vanish as his 21st birthday drew near. Eleanor, hardened by grief but unwilling to accept it as inevitability, decided to take matters into her own hands. She turned not to priests or doctors, but to scholars of the occult, correspondents in London and Edinburgh, who studied texts that others feared to touch. Letters arrived at the estate sealed in wax, filled with diagrams, strange symbols, and instructions for rituals that promised revelation. Eleanor, often in the dead of night, would lock herself in the drawing room and follow the elaborate instructions by candlelight. Servants whispered about her chanting in a language that made their skin crawl, about the strange incense that clung to the halls even hours later. While she maintained the outward image of dignity, her private life had become consumed by this search for knowledge. Some servants left, unable to endure the atmosphere of unease. Others stayed, compelled by loyalty or curiosity, and carried with them stories that would further feed the legend of the Ashcrofts. But if Eleanor expected clarity, she found only darker questions. One night, after hours of chanting and meditation, she claimed to see a figure, a man cloaked in shadows, standing at the far end of the library. He spoke no words, but his presence filled her with such terror that she collapsed. When she awoke, her hair had streaked white as though aged overnight. From that moment, she confessed to those closest to her that the family's curse was not simply misfortune, but the result of a pact. She insisted that centuries earlier, one of the Ashcroft patriarchs had struck a bargain to preserve the family's wealth and land, but the price was steep. Every firstborn son was promised to forces beyond human comprehension before reaching the age of 21. This revelation, whether truth or the invention of a grief-stricken mind, altered the family's trajectory. Eleanor forbade her younger children from leaving the estate, fearing they would attract the attention of whatever shadow haunted them. The Ashcroft house became more of a fortress than a home, its gates shut, its windows shrouded, its halls heavy with incense. Rumors spread that Eleanor was not only protecting her children, but preparing them for some ritual of atonement. Townsfolk avoided the family entirely, though they would often leave offerings at the edge of the estate, flowers, coins, charms, hoping to appease the restless forces tied to the Ashcrofts. As the years passed, Eleanor's determination hardened into obsession. She spoke less of saving her sons and more of negotiating with the shadow she believed bound to them. She entertained no guests, hosted no gatherings, and was said to wander the halls speaking to unseen presences. When her younger son approached his 21st birthday, Eleanor became convinced she had finally devised a way to break the chain. Yet when the morning of his birthday came, the outcome was no different. He was gone without a trace, leaving Eleanor collapsed upon the grand staircase, screaming at the heavens. Her attempts had failed, but they had added a new layer to the Ashcroft mythos. No longer was it simply that the sons disappeared. It was now said that the family was in active communion with the very forces that claimed them. To outsiders, this blurred the line between victim and accomplice. Eleanor died a few years later, her hair completely white, her journals filled with symbols no one could decipher. Some claimed she had grown mad, others believed she had glimpsed too much truth and paid the price. But whether delusion or revelation, her efforts ensured that the Ashcrofts would never again be viewed as merely cursed. They were, in the minds of many, a family entangled in something far older and darker than anyone dared to understand. The autumn of 1847 brought with it a chill unlike any the village of Ashcroft had ever known. The fog clung to the fields and hedgerows like a living thing, heavy and impenetrable, rolling down from the moors with a deliberate menace. Within Ashcroft Manor, the family moved through their days as though they were trapped in some slow-motion dream, each one waiting for the next tragedy to unfurl. By then, the villagers had already taken to whispering of the Ashcroft curse in earnest. The pattern was undeniable. Every son of the lineage had met his fate before the age of 21, and though each death or disappearance carried its own strange shape, the rhythm of inevitability seemed to thrum beneath them all. It was in this climate of dread that young Edmund Ashcroft, the last surviving male heir of his generation, grew into his 16th year. Edmund was unlike his brothers. He had inherited the pale, delicate features of his mother, though there was a sharpness in his dark eyes that suggested both intelligence and suspicion. From the time he could read, Edmund had scoured the manor's library for records of his forebears, piecing together their fates like a puzzle only he seemed determined to solve. He spoke little at family dinners, preferring instead to scribble his findings in a private journal that he kept locked within a small chest beneath his bed. As the leaves fell and the manor's great halls grew colder, Edmund began to notice a pattern beyond what the village gossips had already discerned. In every recorded account, the sons had reported, in some way or another, hearing voices. Whispers at night, faint at first, growing more insistent as their 21st birthdays loomed closer. Some described dreams too vivid to be mere invention, dreams of running through endless corridors, of doors that led nowhere, of voices calling their names from behind locked rooms. Others, more disturbingly, wrote of waking in strange parts of the manor with no memory of how they had gotten there. Edmund did not confide in his family when the voices began for him. At first it was a single syllable, low and muffled, echoing in his ears as though someone stood just behind him. Then, night after night, it grew clearer. His name. Sometimes it was urgent, hissed and frantic. Other times it was almost a lullaby, coaxing him toward some unseen destination. Rather than deny it, Edmund confronted it. He stayed awake for hours with a candle at his bedside, his journal open, determined to catch the voices in their act. He would scribble fragments, half-sentences, fleeting impressions, as though he could pin them to the page and rob them of their power. One evening, when the house was cloaked in silence, Edmund followed the voice. It guided him out of his chambers, down the staircase, and toward the west wing of the manor, a part of the house that had been sealed for decades. The doors were bolted, the windows nailed shut, yet Edmund swore he could hear laughter, thin, reedy, and childlike, emanating from within. His hand trembled on the lock, but he dared not force it open. Instead, he marked the place carefully in his journal, sketching the outline of the corridor and leaving an inscription that chilled him even as he wrote it. The others went inside. I must not. From that night onward, Edmund slept with the weight of dread pressing down on him. He understood now that whatever stalked the Ashcroft sons was not a random cruelty of fate, but something tethered to the walls of the manor itself. It was a hunger, patient and unyielding, waiting for each boy to come of age so it could draw him in. Edmund, however, refused to be consumed so easily. He began drafting letters to neighboring families, coded messages hidden beneath innocuous words, seeking anyone who might know how to break such a curse. Still, in his solitude, Edmund feared the truth. He wondered if the voices were not merely luring him toward the sealed wing, but awakening something already buried deep inside him. The line between hunter and hunted blurred with every passing night, until even Edmund was no longer certain whether he was resisting the legacy of his family, or slowly becoming its instrument. The air around Ashcroft Manor grew heavier as the 19th century waned. By now, the tale of the cursed family had become a fixture of whispered folklore throughout the surrounding villages. Farmers spoke of it in taverns, clergymen preached of it as a warning against ancestral sins, and children dared one another to sneak to the gates of the estate and peer into the haunted windows. Yet for the Ashcrofts themselves, the curse was no longer a tale to be whispered. It was an ever-present noose, tightening with each generation. In the late 1800s, the manor was in the hands of Lord Henry Ashcroft, a man worn down before his time, his eyes hollow from nights spent pacing candlelit halls. His eldest son, Charles, had been taken just a few months prior, vanishing into the mist without so much as a scream. He had been 17. His disappearance was followed by the sound of scratching beneath the floorboards in the days afterward, a grotesque reminder that the curse did not simply kill, it lingered, leaving behind echoes in the manor itself. The surviving Ashcrofts had adopted rituals to protect themselves. Charms were nailed into every doorway, salt was poured across thresholds, and mirrors were covered at night. Still, the curse did not relent. No matter what rites or protections they devised, every boy born into the family met the same fate, gone before his 21st year. Henry's younger son, Edward, watched these preparations with wide eyes, fully aware that his own time was slipping away like sand through a glass. At 19, he was restless, pacing in defiance of the silence that plagued the manor, yet unable to break the cycle that bound him. What terrified Edward most were not the stories of his ancestors, but the voices. They came to him at night, soft and coaxing, calling his name from corners where the shadows clung too tightly to be natural. They promised escape, freedom from the weight of the curse, if only he would follow them into the forest, the same forest from which none of his forefathers had ever returned. He resisted, gripping the cross around his neck, whispering prayers until dawn. But he knew that resistance was not enough. Henry, desperate to save his last son, turned to scholars and mystics, searching for any path toward redemption. He spent a fortune on mediums, priests, and even charlatans who promised to lift the curse. Some claimed the curse was tied to a pact sealed in blood centuries before, that the founder of the family, Elias Ashcroft, had promised the firstborn of every line to the shadows in exchange for power. Others swore that the spirits of those who had been wronged by the Ashcrofts were clawing their way back through the family's veins, demanding repayment in blood. But as with those who came before, no remedy worked. On a storm-choked night, Edward vanished. His room was found in disarray, the sheets torn, the window flung open to the storm, though no footprints marked the drenched earth outside. Henry wandered the manor after that night like a specter himself, clutching at the walls, muttering the names of his lost sons. He lived only a year longer, dying in his library with a candle burned low beside him. His last words, spoken to no one in particular, were, "I tried. Forgive me." And thus, the Ashcroft curse moved to yet another generation, its claws never loosening, its hunger never sated. By the time 1936 arrived, the Ashcroft name had become more of a whispered curse than a mark of lineage. In taverns, in churchyards, in schoolyards where children dared each other to repeat the tale, the family was spoken of only in hushed tones, as though uttering their name aloud might call down the curse itself. Though the house on the hill still stood, its windows dark, and its once grand gardens wild with neglect, its presence loomed like a rotting sentinel over the town. Most avoided the long drive, but a few brave or foolhardy souls would venture close just to say they had looked upon the ruin and lived. It was in this atmosphere that Robert Ashcroft came of age. He was a thoughtful boy, slight of build, with pale features that bore the unmistakable imprint of his family's legacy. At 19, he lived under a shadow more suffocating than any of his ancestors had known, for by then the stories of the curse had become fully enshrined in local lore. Children would stop their games to stare at him when he walked by, as though waiting to see if he would crumble before their eyes. Adults avoided his gaze, muttering half-hearted blessings when he passed. To live as an Ashcroft son was to live as a ghost before one's time. Robert's father, Edmund, had tried to shield him, but grief and despair had hollowed the man out long ago. He was already bent with age, though not yet 60, his eyes dull with resignation. He seldom spoke, preferring instead to haunt the empty halls of the Ashcroft home. His wife had died years earlier, and now Edmund lived only in the shadow of the family's failures, waiting with grim certainty for the day the curse would claim his son. Robert knew it as well as anyone. The expectation hung in the air like a death sentence, and though he tried to deny it, every glance at the calendar reminded him that his 21st birthday crept closer with each passing day. Yet Robert was not like the Ashcroft sons who came before. He had grown weary of fatalism, of whispers and resigned prayers. He wanted to break the cycle, though he had no idea how. The only clue he possessed came from an old trunk he discovered in the house's decaying attic. Among moth-eaten coats and water-damaged books, he found a bundle of letters tied with a black ribbon. They were written in a hand that was not Ashcroft, but rather a name unfamiliar to him, Elias Marlowe. The letters spoke of an agreement, a pact struck generations earlier between Robert's great-great-grandfather and a figure Marlowe only referred to as the Watcher. They spoke of wealth exchanged for sons, of bloodlines paid in debt. The words chilled Robert, for it was the first time he had seen the curse described not as a rumor, but as a deliberate contract. Terrified and yet determined, Robert confronted his father with the letters. Edmund's reaction was one of horror. His trembling hands pushed the papers away as though they burned. He confessed that he had heard rumors of such an agreement, but had never sought the truth, preferring ignorance to certainty. But Robert could not abide ignorance. He resolved that he would uncover the full truth of the pact, no matter what it cost him. For the first time in Ashcroft history, a son dared to defy the narrative written for him. Yet defiance is not always met with reward. As Robert pursued the truth, the town turned colder still. Neighbors claimed to see him walking in places no young man should go, the cemetery at midnight, the ruined chapel at the edge of the moors. They said he muttered to himself, or perhaps to someone unseen. The more he dug into the mystery, the more it seemed the curse itself pressed against him, eager to swallow him whole. And when Robert failed to appear one November evening, vanishing as though the earth had opened to take him, the town shook its head in grim confirmation. The curse had claimed another. But whispers spread in its aftermath, whispers unlike any that had come before. Some claimed Robert had succeeded in unearthing a piece of the bargain, that he had not simply vanished, but been taken by design. Others said he had fled, carrying with him knowledge that could end the Ashcroft legacy forever. No body was found, no proof was offered, only absence, the one inheritance the Ashcroft sons could never avoid. The spring of 1927, brought an unease that clung to Ashcroft Manor like mold upon damp stone. The family, now dwindled and brittle from generations of whispered curses and premature losses, tried desperately to maintain the appearance of aristocratic grace. Yet, beneath the silverware polished to a shine and the servants' trained bows, there remained a fear that could not be silenced. For Thomas Ashcroft, the last surviving heir of his generation, was nearing his 21st birthday, and with each passing day, the air in the manor grew heavier, as though the house itself anticipated the inevitable. Thomas had been raised with both tenderness and severity, for his mother, Eleanor, understood all too well the pattern etched in their bloodline. Every son, without exception, vanished before the age of 21. Some disappeared into forests, others into rivers, some without a trace at all. And though she tried to shield him from the stories, Thomas had pieced together enough from servants' gossip and the hollow-eyed portraits lining the halls. He did not laugh as other boys his age laughed, nor did he indulge in careless wanderings. His was a life of caution, every step measured, every glance behind his shoulder deliberate. In an attempt to outwit fate, Eleanor sought the counsel of spiritualists and clergymen alike. Mediums were invited into the drawing room, where they lit candles and whispered incantations in foreign tongues. Priests blessed the walls with holy water until the wallpaper blistered and peeled. A Romani seer laid her hand upon Thomas's forehead and declared that the boy was marked not by choice, but by inheritance. None of it brought Eleanor peace. Each supposed protection seemed only to deepen her dread. Thomas, however, bore himself with a strange, almost resigned composure. He had inherited the Ashcroft sharpness of mind, and though fear shadowed him, he refused to cower beneath it. He began poring over the family's ledgers and journals, reading accounts written in shaky hands by uncles, grandfathers, great-grandfathers, all detailing their futile attempts to resist the curse. By candlelight, he copied their notes into a secret ledger of his own, a testament to his determination to confront the fate that had consumed his bloodline. On the night of his 21st birthday, the manor seemed to bristle with anticipation. Eleanor locked every door, stationed servants in the hallways, and forbade Thomas from stepping beyond the main chamber. The clocks ticked with dreadful insistence, each chime pulling the household closer to the hour. Thomas sat alone at his desk, the ledger open before him, the weight of centuries pressing upon his shoulders. Midnight drew near, and with it, the silence thickened into something oppressive. When the clock struck 12, the candles flickered violently, though no draught touched the room. A deep groan reverberated through the manor, as though its foundations were protesting some ancient debt. Thomas rose to his feet, clutching his ledger like a shield, and in the wavering candlelight he saw, just for a breath, a shadow stretching across the wall. It was shaped like his own, yet it moved independently, its arms reaching, its head tilting as though regarding him with mocking familiarity. Eleanor rushed in at his cry, but the chamber was empty save for the smoldering wick of a candle extinguished by unseen fingers. Thomas Ashcroft was gone. His ledger lay upon the desk, open to the last line he had written. "If I vanish, it is not into nothingness, but into them." The manor did not mourn aloud. It merely absorbed the loss as it had done countless times before, its walls swallowing another echo, another heir, another son never to see beyond 21. The autumn of 1978 was wet and cruel, the kind of season that seemed determined to rot the very bones of Ashcroft Manor. The rain had carved trenches through the garden paths, filled with water so dark they mirrored the house itself, fractured, gray, and crumbling. Within the manor's shadow lived the last remaining Ashcroft heir, a boy named Sebastian, not yet 21, but already cloaked in the awareness of his family's curse. His parents had spoken little of it, whispering only in half-truths and broken phrases, yet Sebastian had grown up on stories from the townsfolk, rumors that every Ashcroft son disappeared before reaching his 21st year. The weight of those words followed him like a second skin, especially now, with only months separating him from that fatal age. Sebastian was a peculiar child, thoughtful and inward, with eyes too old for his face. He spent much of his time in the decaying library, sifting through yellowed journals and ledgers left behind by his ancestors. He sought answers, convinced that if he uncovered the truth of the family's misfortunes, he might find a way to break the pattern. But the more he read, the less clarity he found. The journals were riddled with contradictions. One entry claimed the firstborn had vanished into the forest, another that he had drowned in the nearby river. Yet none explained why. Some spoke of a pact, others of punishment, but all ended abruptly, the ink smeared as though written in haste, as though the writer had been interrupted by something just beyond the door. The house itself seemed to conspire against him. At night, Sebastian would hear whispers, so soft they might have been mistaken for wind creeping through cracks in the walls, but too deliberate in their cadence to be anything natural. He often woke drenched in sweat, his sheets tangled around him, the faint impression of fingers on his wrist, as though someone, or something, had tried to pull him from the bed. His parents dismissed his fears as imagination, the residue of a childhood filled with too many ghost stories, yet they too looked haunted, their faces hollow, their steps heavy. One evening, restless and sleepless, Sebastian wandered the manor halls, his lantern trembling in his hand. The house groaned under the weight of storm winds, its rafters creaking like a ship about to split. He found himself outside the locked cellar door, a place forbidden to him all his life. The key, he realized, had always been in his father's study, tucked inside a drawer of the great oak desk. He had never dared take it before. But tonight, some magnetic pull urged him onward, a voice not his own whispering that the answers lay below. With a hand that shook yet did not hesitate, he fetched the key and slid it into the lock. The door opened with a moan that reverberated down into the dark. The cellar smelled of damp stone and old iron. His lantern cast long shadows against the walls, revealing shelves of decayed bottles, rusted tools, and what at first appeared to be bundles of cloth. But as Sebastian stepped closer, his stomach turned. These were not bundles. They were shrouds, tattered and stained, each tagged with names he knew from the journals. Ashcroft's sons, every one of them. He stumbled backward, bile rising in his throat when he noticed something else. At the far end of the cellar, a circle of stones marked with strange runes lay embedded into the floor. The air above it shimmered, not with heat, but with a vibration that made his skin crawl. He had seen drawings of this symbol before, in his great-grandfather's notes, described only as the mark of the pact. Sebastian's lantern flickered, and for a heartbeat the cellar was plunged into blackness. In that moment he felt them, figures pressing close, unseen yet suffocating, whispering in a language older than the manor itself. When the flames sputtered back to life, he was alone. But he knew with absolute certainty that the circle had not been waiting for him to discover it. It had been waiting for him to step inside. As he fled back up the stairs, slamming the cellar door behind him, Sebastian realized something far worse than the truth of his family's curse. It was not chance that determined when the Ashcroft sons disappeared. It was invitation. By the time the story of the Ashcrofts reached its final act, the family was but a hollow echo of what it had once been. The manor, though still standing on its windswept cliffside, had long since slipped into ruin. Moss and ivy devoured its stone walls, windows stood shattered, and the air inside was thick with mildew and silence. Yet the legend of the curse endured, carried on whispers in the surrounding villages, as if the soil itself still remembered. For the every tavern tale and hushed fireside recounting, the refrain was always the same. No Ashcroft son would live to see his 21st birthday. When James Ashcroft, the last known heir, was born in the winter of 1987, the people of Devonshire spoke his name with both pity and fear. His father, Henry, had broken tradition by moving the family away from the crumbling manor, settling in a modest estate closer to town. He believed distance could sever them from the fate that had haunted his bloodline for centuries. But blood is stubborn, and curses even more so. Henry kept records hidden in a locked chest, detailing every disappearance, every death, every failed attempt to thwart the pattern. He resolved never to tell James, hoping ignorance would be his protection. As James grew, he became a bright and curious child. but there was always a shadow about him, an air of solemnity for one so young. He was prone to nightmares that he could never remember in detail, waking drenched in sweat, whispering of voices calling his name from across water. On the eve of his 18th birthday, James stumbled upon the chest. Despite his father's desperate attempts, the truth could not be contained forever. The boy pored over those journals, his eyes wide as he read of generations of Ashcroft sons vanishing before the cusp of adulthood. He learned of Ellis's disappearance into the marsh, of Thomas's fate in the war, of Nathaniel swallowed by the sea. The pattern was unbroken, unwavering, merciless. The weight of knowledge changed him. He became restless, driven by an obsession to understand the curse. While his father begged him to forget what he had read, James could not resist the pull of history. He traveled to the manor, now abandoned, ignoring Henry's pleas. He spent days combing through its broken halls, studying cryptic etchings in the cellar and faded murals on the dining room walls. He traced his hand over the old family crest carved into stone, where beneath layers of dust he found strange runes, not English, not Latin, but something older. The more he uncovered, the more he became convinced that the Ashcrofts were bound to some pact made long ago, an agreement sealed in blood and loss. A diary fragment hinted at it, a desperate ancestor calling upon powers in the deep woods, begging for prosperity in exchange for a price not yet understood. That price, James believed, was the firstborn son of every generation. It was not random tragedy, not misfortune. It was ritual. The sons were claimed. As James's 21st birthday loomed, fear gave way to defiance. He declared he would not flee, nor would he surrender himself quietly as his forefathers had. He returned to the manor one final time, carrying with him candles, salt, and the last of his family's records. He intended to confront whatever ancient force lingered in those stones. Witnesses, locals who swore they kept watch from a distance, claimed they saw lights flickering in the broken windows that night, accompanied by low rumbling like thunder, though the skies were clear. Some said they heard screams carried by the wind. Others swore it was laughter. When dawn came, the manor was silent once more. Inside, no trace of James was found. His belongings lay scattered across the floor, the candles burned down to nubs. In the cellar, where the crest had been carved, the stone appeared freshly marked, as though the runes had been cut anew. James Ashcroft, like all the sons before him, had vanished without a trace. Henry, left alone and broken, never returned to the manor. He died a recluse, his mind lost to grief. With him, the line of the Ashcrofts ended. No son remained to inherit the curse, no heir to continue the pattern. Some whispered that James's disappearance was the last payment, that the pact was finally complete. Others believed the force still lingers, waiting, restless, for another descendant to rise from some forgotten branch of the family tree. The manor still stands today, leaning against the sea, its windows like black eyes staring into eternity. Travelers who pass too close swear they hear footsteps within or see a figure watching from the highest room. And in the towns nearby, the story of the Ashcrofts is still told, a family marked by shadows, every son claimed before 21. Whether it was fate, punishment, or the consequence of a bargain struck in desperation, no one can say for certain. But the land remembers, and the curse of the Ashcrofts lingers, a chilling reminder that some debts are never truly paid.